If a man would persist in his folly, he would become wise. William Blake.
I'm Gale Huxley.
I'm Rick Chambers.
Welcome to Book Sense. We view the world through perceptual lenses. You carry many of them with you now. Your common sense, your culture. On Book Sense, we talk about all aspects of life, history, and society through the lens of stories. So choose your tool, a lens or a spyglass. Use it to break through soil until you feel fresh air, and join us. Hey folks, this is Book Sense. You've heard of common sense and may or may not possess it. Common sense is one of the lenses through which we view the world. We use common sense to make some of the most basic yet important decisions, like choosing not to walk up to a bear when you see it in the woods. It's universal in some ways, but it's also very much formed by a society, a culture, a family. Let's elaborate on what we mean by the term book sense. You've probably heard the term book smart at some point in your life. This means a person that is book smart has gained their knowledge mostly through reading and studying books. Instead of using the term book smart, instead consider it as book sense.
So when it's defined or contemplated in this way, it does not define a person's type of intelligence. Instead, it's just one of the senses that we can utilize when needed. It's a strength. Book sense allows you the strength to concentrate, analyze, empathize, imagine. Some may think book sense will slowly become extinct as screen sense becomes more important and predominant. This is not the case. Some things can only be extracted and understood through reading comprehension. As time progressed, we developed this sense. Just because technology develops and becomes more intelligent, that does not mean this sense is no longer necessary or important. Instead, we carry this sense along with our other important senses. Book sense is just another lens to view your world through. But unlike common sense, you have complete control of book sense. You can choose what you consume, what you pay attention to, what you want to fuse into your very being.
In this podcast, Dr. Rick Chambers and I will take a look at a different quote or phrase every week. We will dissect it, diagram it, by meaning instead of by parts of speech, and discuss what it means, personally, as a culture, or in context to what is going on in the world. A lot of shows, some great, like School of Life, give summaries, very brief lessons on very big topics. Book sense is the microscopic, little picture version of that. And though we say little picture, that doesn't diminish how much can be mined from just one phrase. In some cases, the whole book can be summed up in one sentence. A large part of what makes books so special is that they either place us in someone's perspective very different than that of our own, or conversely, very much like our own, eerily so sometimes. The most relatable stories are not broad and generic, one size fits all. They are ultra-personal and specific. We will be discussing the universal through the experience of the individual. If you're wondering who the individuals are you're listening to, we'll give you a quick introduction.
Hello, I'm Dr. Rick Chambers, and I've worked for the past 25 or more years as a psychotherapist in private practice. And yet I think I've been invited to this show because of my love of reading, but it's more than a love even. I would call it my path in life. It's part of my soul path or my path. Books have been very important to my professional career, but also to me as a person. So I'm really excited about the opportunity. In the introduction, we made some claims about book sense. And hopefully we'll have time, or as we get into this, to kind of validate or explore those claims about how books may be a very particular or unique way of perceiving things in the world you can't perceive in another way. So, thank you.
Hello, my name is Gale Huxley. I started off as a reader, and I still am. but now I'm also a writer. I was connected to book sense before I even knew the term or became familiar with the concept. From the time I was very young, when I was upset or just needed some guidance, I would turn to books. And sometimes not even the full book. I would pick a book off of the shelf, leaf through it, and choose a sentence. And the sentence would comfort me and provide more therapy or guidance than any individual face-to-face conversation would. So as I read these phrases, quotes, or entire books that inspired me or motivated me, I always wanted to share them with someone. I didn't want to keep it to myself. When I met Dr. Rick, we would talk about books all the time because we were both so interested in talking about not just books, but phrases and sentences from books. And that's where we got the idea for this podcast.
And so these conversations would become more of an exploration of the meanings or kind of the interpretations. It was this process I had kind of longed for, to be able to, not just reading, but through discussion of reading, to continue to explore and share some of the perceptions that are possible, through this lens of the written word.
Yeah. And it's wonderful to have someone to be able to talk to about books and book sense, but we want to share it with not just each other, but you.
Our guess is there are people out there that desire or have desired the same thing. But it is hard to find someone else that shares this particular passion.
Yes, because this isn't like a book club. We're not talking about the plot of a book, the structure of a book, or the author's intentions.
This is a nonfiction book. I'm kind of a specialist in nonfiction. I think you're kind of a specialist more in fiction.
Yes, I read fiction more than I read nonfiction.
And we're going to find they're more related than people generally think. But this is from chapter 3 of the book, and there's often a short quote to kind of set the tone for the entire book. And this is a book on tarot, and the first tarot card is the Fool. And so
he's not even number 1, though. He's 0. He's even before the first one.
He's a big 0. And so chapter 3 is the Fool in Tarot and Us. And he's titled, the title of the card is the Fool. And so this quote, if a man would persist in his folly, he would become wise. It's from a poem by William Blake, who's a Romantic poet, and we're going to talk a lot about the Romantic tradition here, but he's one of the Romantic poets, and kind of putting together foolishness or folly and wisdom in a very, a declarative sentence. He would become wise if he persists in folly.
No, there's no questioning there. You would become, or you will become wise.
Yes. I think it's interesting. He didn't say you will become successful, you will become a leader. He said you will become wise. And the point being Marriage of Heaven and Hell, it's about kind of combining things that aren't usually combined, which is very much a Romantic technique. I hesitate to say anyone that we think of as wise, looking back at their life and not able to see some folly as they were beginning, or in kind of the whole project. Most people who are wise are very aware of there was an element of folly as they were beginning.
Yeah.
Where someone who's only had success, or the typical kind of success without struggle, they may be successful, but I don't know if they would be wise.
It seems impossible to become successful without some folly, without some failure, unless you were, say, born into it, like being born into wealth or being born into fame.
Yes. And so it's maybe a play on the Edison's, I found 10,000 ways to not make a light bulb of the word persist is also very important. But maybe the best approach to take on this is Socrates. There was this prophecy that he was the wisest human, and he didn't believe it. And he went around asking people, though, and as he found out what they didn't know, and they thought they were wise, but he could find things they didn't know, he said, maybe I am the wisest person ever because I know that I don't know everything. And he's the father of kind of philosophy, the love of wisdom, and it was this strange path toward wisdom of the only thing you can know for certain is what was a mistake or what didn't work. And so the Socratic method, people think it's asking questions, but it's really being aware that you don't know.
Wisdom isn't something that's usually viewed as something you earn. It's something that's given to you if you live long enough. If you talk to any old man or old woman, you just assume they're wise, because if you live long enough, you have to experience bad things or tragedy, or it's not going to be an easy ride for 80 or 90 years.
Yes.
So can you be young and be wise? Is that possible?
And then how do you know when you're wise, or what's the criteria for that? So it's this word that we have, but the criteria, I guess, has changed through the years or at different times. But it's a concept that's really not very well defined.
No. I mean, because then you have to differentiate between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is much easier to say that you have it or it's measured.
That's not the main point of books and of the written word. It can certainly present facts and information, but it's as if often it's kind of pointing to things that aren't easily seen and easily defined and easily understood. And Blake kind of pioneered. We're living in this world of like grabbing people's attention through like increased volume and through excitement and those kind of things. How did the poets do it in the old days? This quote catches your attention and challenges you. He's kind of saying like, figure this out. It's kind of like a Zen cone, a puzzle to figure out, how does this sentence make sense?
As you say, it grabs your attention. It makes me think of that it's like 18th century clickbait in a way.
Excellent.
But clickbait that actually pays off. Because today, if you see a title that's really grabbing and you click on the video, often there's nothing, it has nothing to do with the title. It's just something to draw you in.
Yes, this is a quote I've lived with for years. So it's not owned to the next clickbait. No,
it's a quote that you can get lost in and stay with and never figure out completely.
And like the Fool or the zero in the tarot deck or the Joker in the regular deck of cards, you can forget about it and then it shows up unexpectedly. Mm-hmm. And it is when we see this link between it. Maybe it's getting at knowing and not knowing, and our culture values knowing so much, having all the facts, having all the information.
And look where it's gotten us.
It's what if that's not? What if something about not knowing all the information has to do with this concept of wisdom?
And that's not to say that their facts don't have their place.
Absolutely.
Science.
So just this morning on the radio, the personalities were saying people today go to Google rather than grandfather. And perhaps now that we're living in a world where there is so much information, the challenge is always to like filter through information or to not be overwhelmed by information. And so maybe there is this, or it creates a need for a shift from, and maybe it's an illusion that like more facts, more information is like all we need in order to live our lives.
Yeah. I mean, it's nice to have Google or something to turn to, but there's no education about how to handle it. And because it's so new and presented to us, we haven't had the chance to step away and think that there are other ways or go back to older or more classical ways of gaining knowledge.
So I've done a talk on wisdom before, because at one point I thought I'm going to have a business that helps people develop wisdom. And I said, but what if I go to the bank and I tell people, like, that's my business and I'd like a loan in the world today?
Yeah.
I see psychotherapy as helping people develop wisdom. And yet, again, it's not a goal or an aspiration that people generally have.
Yeah. Today it's a goal the goal is to be happier.
Excellent.
Rather than gain wisdom.
Right? And it doesn't say, like, that he will be happy. That's not promised in folly. And in fact, we're going to talk later on about how, like, the emotions around folly can be extremely painful. But jumping back to, like, talking with grandfather, we usually associate wisdom with older age or with, like, kind of a previous generation, grandfathers, grandmothers, the elders in some sense.
Yeah.
That's a concept that's kind of disappeared in the world today. But I would have people imagine a wise person. And, like, one of the qualities, like, what would be the qualities of a wise person? And one that comes up very, very often, not a smart person, but a wise person. If you don't have a sense of humor, I don't think anyone would ever describe you as wise. And they have a particular kind of humor where they kind of laugh at themselves.
A self-deprecating type of humor.
Yes. But also of, like, life is kind of funny sometimes, or it's like being able to see this joke that's kind of played sometimes, see the humor in things.
I was talking last night because I watched a video by this YouTuber named Hank Pecos. He's a storm chaser. But in a video he posted recently, his car got hit by hail and his windshield was shattered. And he said, when things are going good, it's really good. And when it's bad, it's funny. And I really liked that. And ever since I heard that, anytime something goes bad, I try to filter that through whatever I'm thinking.
Yes. So now we have William Blake, Socrates. There's another wise person, Alan Watts, and we're on the end of talking about wisdom in old age. But just like Blake, Alan Watts and the Zen tradition kind of turns wisdom on its head by saying and valuing what's called the beginner's mind.
And what is the beginner's mind?
Within the Zen tradition, it is not being impaired and by what you already know. Being able to perceive something in its purity, being able to perceive and to act from this place of that hasn't been shaped by your culture, your history. Some of the gurus would say, show me your original face. Show me who you were before you got wounded. Show me who you really are if you had not had this particular history.
It sounds incredibly difficult because you're shaped by your culture from the time you're born, shaped by your family.
Right? And so only a wisdom tradition would even bring up this as a possibility, or that there's something outside of culture even. And so there are all of these tricksters like Alan Watts, Socrates, Blake. And clickbait is a kind of a good. They're using shocking kind of things to kind of break you out of the typical ways of thinking.
So what are the limits of the beginner's mind? Because a beginner's mind, that's a little baby who doesn't know how to do anything. How do you achieve the beginner's mind?
Another quality of wise people that people would talk about, they have a certain attitude toward and valuing of children, sometimes more than stuffy adults. And so it's this idea, or it's this valuing of a person's honest reaction to something and a sincere reaction. So children haven't developed all the socially appropriate. And so it's not saying be a child, but it is saying value this like fresh approach to things, but also not knowing. Who learns faster, a child or an adult?
A child, of course, yeah.
And so what you know, it was this like really basic insight that what you know, everything you know begins to interfere with the learning process and the ability to learn new things. But even in, we're back to something else we can't define, like the beginner's mind. Like there's no how-to manual on the beginner's mind. And so Alan Watts throws out this term, or the tradition actually has this term that is a puzzle. It's saying figure it out, but it's also saying think about this for years and years and years.
That sounds like a very long process.
Rather than look it up on Google, here's the definition, now I know what the beginner's mind is.
But what do you turn to? Because even books, if you turn to a book, that can give you a fairly quick answer. Is he saying to not turn to anything, or to spend years and years turning to books and talking to people?
So within Zen, it's often used like in learning a skill of archery. And so it's not saying like don't try to hit the target, don't try to be an archer, but like as you're trying, you're not trying to like become an expert, you're trying to rediscover, after all the hours of practice, then rediscover the beginner's mind. So it's not saying don't look, don't seek information.
Yes.
Certainly you should do that.
So to have a beginner's mind, that suggests that once you achieve a beginner's mind or get into that mind space after how many years, that you will slowly grow away from the beginner's mind again. So is the beginner's mind something that we should constantly be trying to return to as we gain wisdom?
Excellent. There's no finish point. Oh, that's done.
Yes, because as returning to this quote again, if a man would persist in his folly, he would become wise. That kind of makes me sad in a way, because that suggests the trip sounds fun. It sounds interesting to persist in your folly. I almost wouldn't want to become wise. That suggests that there's an ending to it. So is it almost inaccurate a way that you should never become wise? You should always try to backtrack.
So with the full being numbered 0, is that the end or the beginning of the journey? That it's this ambiguous, again, it's this ambiguous thing of like, it's ongoing, you never get there, but you begin from an interesting place. And what they're doing is subverting, like kind of in valuing children, in valuing folly, valuing things that are usually discredited, looked down on. They're challenging people to try to see things in a different way.
So as I was thinking about this quote, it's not that folly and making mistakes isn't valued. It's just that it's usually only valued up to a certain point in your life. And that's where I get tripped up. Because
you're allowed to make mistakes.
Yeah, if you're
to not know.
Yeah, if you're a youth, if you're very young, it's encouraged. Because it's seen that, well, later on in life, you're going to have responsibilities. You're going to have a family. You're not going to have the luxury of being the fool.
Oh,
so
man.
Is there an end to that? Can you have a family, have children, be entrenched in responsibilities and still be a fool? Or to be a fool, would you have to be selfish?
So we were talking about this technique of valuing what's not usually valued, turning values on their head, in order to look at all sides of something. So we'll talk about the biggest folly of all is romantic love.
Yeah. Often when a relationship ends badly, one of the people in the relationship will say, "You've made a fool out of me."
Which is the worst condemnation.
Yeah, that's the biggest source of hurt, to feel like someone's made you an idiot.
Yes. And yet, is it possible to fall in love or to commit to someone without risking being the fool?
Not fully. You can enter a relationship, but I think it will hurt the relationship tremendously if you're holding back so much of yourself.
Yes.
It's called to fall in love. To
Yes.
look at the tarot card of the Fool, he's not falling off a cliff, but he's close to stepping off of it.
So there's danger. But we'll go more into the card itself, but he seems unconcerned about the danger.
Yes.
And there's this attitude of being in danger, but not inhibited.
Yeah.
And
Not inhibited. Is he even aware that he's in danger? The Fool?
right?
That's up for debate.
Excellent. Everything about the card is up for debate.
It's very ambiguous.
Yes. Which the current world has completely lost a taste for. Ambiguous signals, ambiguity, mixed messages, paradox, mystery.
Yes, but strangely, because we've lost a taste for it, I feel like we're in more of an ambiguous world than ever. Because there's so much information, there's so much that could be right, wrong, or somewhere in the middle, and it's different for every person.
At the same time as there's this attitude of like, don't make a mistake.
Yeah. And now, because it's all usually out there on the internet or somewhere
And
to
forever.
make a mistake.
Like
Yeah.
digital. It's there forever.
Yeah, there's no coming back from it, not even if you delete it yourself.
Yes. So this romantic love, and even in love, we've talked about the myth of Peyton Lameau. It's this Buddhist myth where she's riding a donkey running away, and kind of people are shooting arrows at her. And everywhere the arrow goes into the donkey, it becomes an eye. And I think that's a very powerful symbol for what happens in life and in love. Getting hurt doesn't feel good at the time, but it can become a knowing. It can become a way of seeing, an eye, a way of perceiving. And so all of our wounds are kind of a way of learning. Like a child, when they become aware of something that everyone else knew but they didn't, it's a humiliating, and that's the feeling most associated with the fool, is like humiliation. There's feeling like the fool yourself, but it's really being seen as publicly, like being seen as a fool. It's kind of interesting. The first card, he's by himself.
Except for a little dog.
Yes. Like now there's the helpful animal like friend. Instincts. A gut feeling. Intuition. So it's just him and his instincts. So he's not surrounded by a crowd. He's not having to worry what people think.
The Fool's journey can only be taken alone. So circling back to romantic love, I was just thinking, we have such short memories when it comes to the wisdom we've gained through pain. You know that because if relationships gone wrong or anything that's really gone wrong in your life, you've gained knowledge, you've learned from it, you've gained wisdom. But we don't really keep that in mind as we look towards the future. It's always scary and almost we're unwilling to try a new relationship, to fall in love again, because you don't think, okay, well, no matter what, I'm going to gain wisdom. No matter what, it's scary.
So we have a short memory for what we've learned, but in some ways, what if the pain is so bad for many people, they don't even know that they learned something? And we have a very long memory for pain. And so what happens, like we're biologically wired to remember every pain in a way so that we don't touch the stove again.
Yes.
And so as you accumulate those things, it becomes harder and harder to trust, to try, and your life becomes avoiding pain. But what if there's this way of transforming pain into like wisdom and knowledge? And that's not a myth out in our culture now. It's just like you made a mistake, find someone who's perfect. Like,
Yeah, there's someone that's ideal for you out there when that's just not the case.
right? Which is also like blaming the victim, that there's this whole thing that if you got hurt, you were somehow foolish.
Mm-hmm.
But if you get hurt for falling in love, like,
Yeah.
that shouldn't be foolish.
Yes, but people who continually enter new relationships with such optimism,
Yes.
they are looked at as naive.
So in asking people to kind of free associate with wisdom, another quality that came out is wise people know how to manage and deal with and have dealt with pain and suffering in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
They don't see it as just pain. They seem to do something with it.
Yeah. What would a wise person do with pain?
So there are a couple of things. I have this little myth that the soul, within the psyche, within our psychology, it's one of its purposes is transforming suffering and experience into wisdom. And maybe a better example with that being a creative person, think about blues music, or think about novels, songs. Often, so many of them are sad or melancholy, but especially blues. They've taken these hard experiences and transformed it into something,
Yeah.
perhaps beautiful, and also something that other people find like joy in. That's magic. So it's a revaluing. It's not this automatic, like just seeking happiness, or perhaps there's something a little beyond, like just that smiley face, like picture. That's not the ultimate in our like desires. Creative people really work on that. Almost all the quotes you sent me as potential for this show, some of them were kind of tough and like highlighted like some really difficult feelings.
Yeah, so as I said at the beginning, when I was feeling really lost in life, and I still do, I turn to a book for comfort. People being willing to share their pain with such honesty and rawness, even if it's fiction, that's been my greatest comfort.
Yes. When you're experiencing pain, you're alone. And yet there's something about like kind of when an author is able to express it, you're no longer alone. So while the fool is alone, there is this comfort in knowing other people have felt similar pain. Everyone feels pain.
Yeah.
You who knew like reading a book alone is kind of the time that you don't feel alone.
Yeah. I mean, that's largely I read to understand the lives of other people and other experiences, step into other worlds, but also because that's how I've learned the most about myself. Because the books that mean the most to me, it's because I've thought, oh wow, there's someone else, thank God, that feels the same as I do.
Yes. So you can't understand others without understanding yourself without understanding others, but we were talking about like facts, information, data. not the facts, like where they're from. Like you don't read statistic manuals.
I'm sure some people do, but
Right? But you don't. And
Yeah.
a novel, especially
Yeah.
nonfiction, it's not about statistics
no.
or data. It's about experience.
And it seems like as we're talking that pain is mostly shared through art or from creative people. And that is what's maybe lacking in the world too. It seems like it should be left to certain mediums, the sharing of pain, instead of being very open in daily life about it. About having
Excellent.
conversations that are very open.
Right. Thich Nhat Hanh is a Buddhist monk that's done a tremendous work around the issue of anger. And he has the best metaphor for that of, like you take your anger and you put it in the compost bin. So it's contained. And then you turn it over. And in a period of time, it becomes something, it goes in as something, as trash or as something you want to get away from. And as you work with it, it becomes good soil.
So putting in a compost bin is different than just shoving it deep down within you.
Excellent.
Because
It transforms it. The soul is an organ for transforming, like or romantic. Like people talk about this word like transformative or transformation. And so the work in therapy, or there's this work. So a lot of the pain that's just put out there now, they haven't worked on it. It's just, here it is, deal with it. Or here it is.
There's no education about how to deal with it, really.
Exactly. No tradition, no understanding, or no messages about, like, it's just, you must have made a mistake if you're feeling pain. Nobody else is feeling pain. Everybody else knows, like, how to be happy.
Why can't I? Why can't you?
Yes. And that, like, heaps suffering onto the burden, and again makes you feel alone and ashamed. In valuing the full, is it about defying shame or the fear of being shamed by others?
Yes, I mentioned this earlier as we were talking, not recording, that one of my biggest regrets in life so far is that I haven't been the fool. That I've been so afraid of feeling shame from acting foolishly because I'm so concerned with every movement I make, with every word I make, what someone will think about me. And now I see how much that's held me back.
Right. So another thing these authors do is kind of encourage you to take a risk.
And that's actually one of the places in my life where I have revealed the most about myself. And I think a lot of people find comfort in art because that's where you can reveal like the silliest parts of you, the parts of you that you're not sure about, where there's not really room for that in daily life.
And again, it's this transformation that it's like, then it's your work, it's not you. Like many artists are very hesitant to like talk about their life, but in their work they will reveal
Everything.
right?
Yeah. Yes.
But it's somewhat removed, or it's gone through a transformative process.
That's why a lot of artists, they have a persona or that's can remove them like are from themselves.
Yes.
Kind of.
Or perhaps create the freedom to be honest. And to create and to risk. And along this topic, I think it's also good to kind of come back to the card. The most significant thing, I used to say the fool is stepping over the cliff, but as I was preparing for this, I noticed he's on the edge of the cliff. And so to me, what that symbolizes is the fool has come to the very limits. Whatever their culture is, they come to the limits of the knowledge of the day. the limits of what's known. They're in between the known and the unknown. They're right on the edge of the unknown. And yet they're still standing there at that boundary. And you're bringing up an important, so there's folly and there's foolishness of like destructive behavior and like irresponsibility. And so the challenge is to kind of stay on this edge where you're taking enough risk, but you're not like harming too many people, or you're not there's restraint even in folly.
So that's something I was curious about. To be the fool, is it necessary to be selfish? Will other people get hurt on the fool's path? Because it's difficult. How does a fool know if they're hurting somebody, or if they're following their path at someone else's expense?
Right. And again, creative people are such an example. If you think of authors and stuff, I'm not sure, but I believe William Blake, who wrote all these kind of his like was very radical in his work, had a wife and kids and a family and a job and a like kind of a normal life in many ways.
That seems like the exception, though.
Perhaps.
Yes.
Or perhaps not. And it's the most instructive example of like a creative person that even destroys themselves.
Yeah.
They went over the edge. That there is this like temperance and restraint, and the challenge would be how to like meet your responsibilities and not live irresponsibly, but to live not under just meeting other people's expectations. Like, where's the line in that?
Yeah. Well, I say it's the exception because there's so many writers, their lives that I idolize and want to follow after. And most of them, they lived pretty selfishly, or they lived dangerously, or they died very young. And the exceptions that I've seen, there's only very few that I've seen that stayed married, had children, lived a very just kind of average life, like Stephen King. Like he's been married with children, but you don't see like Hunter S. Thompson or
like Stephen King, whose mind goes to some scary places.
And that's not to say it hasn't been without issues, but he lives a fairly normal life in comparison.
Yes. And artists that produce for a few years versus artists that produce for a lifetime, or produce one work versus like a lot of work. Some artists are able to find this edge and not fall off the cliff, and others fall off the cliff. But you mentioned like selfishness. There is a very destructive aspect to that. Even in Blake's time, he was trying to give us a little bit of freedom from a too bounded, too restrictive rationality of like calculating everything. Rather than living with the helpful little dog of your intuition, living from instinct, living from somewhere else that's not only rational.
Your intuition, too. Because
yes,
I read tarot not because I think there's any...
Imagination.
Yes. I read tarot not because I think there's supernatural forces guiding me, but as a way to get in touch with my intuition. Because whenever I read a card, I think, all right, this is really confusing. What does this mean? And as I reflect on it, there's just something that eventually arises.
We started with comparing this to common sense. It's kind of like common sense happens to you. You just perceive the world in a very you just perceive the world. But
it's more practical.
Yes. And certainly we need some of that, but what gets silenced is intuition and the ability, and here we are back with the idea of like, it's sensing, it's being able to perceive something that's not obvious, not immediate, not right in front of your eyes.
The fool, he's not looking out for himself, but who is he looking out for? That's not immediately obvious, but if he continues on this path, looking up at the sky with good intentions, then one can assume that the meaning of his journey, the outcome, will be something positive because he went along with the right intentions. And if you follow a path with the right intentions, it's bound to help someone.
He's the beginning card,
Yes.
not the end.
And what comes next is the magician.
There are many more characters. In summary, I think the main thing here again, like kind of just through this quote, the book sense allows you to access things that aren't immediately obvious around issues of the imaginal, intuition, and then from the poem Marriage of Heaven and Hell, like the combination of opposites, paradox, mystery. I'm glad we started with this one, and maybe we did, to kind of both to challenge the audience, but also to tune them in. We're going to talk a lot about mystery in these shows.
Also, I'm not sure if we mentioned this, but we're connecting so strongly with this card because in a sense we are the fools. We're not
just starting.
Yes, we're just starting. We're not exactly sure where we're going or how it's going to go, but we have to begin somewhere. And that's why this episode is titled The Fools Build Scaffolding, because we are building scaffolding. We're building maybe a semi-permanent, maybe one day more structurally sound.
Because we have this intuition that we're preparing something. This isn't the final product, but it's necessary to get to the final product. In one of our episodes, we use a quote by Marshall McLuhan that goes, "There are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We are all crew." This is how we see Book Sense. Gale and I are crew, so are you. We hope for your contributions, perspectives, and conversations to build Book Sense and make it better and better. Until next time,